going to be kind of a smaller number here in the classroom because, let me turn my mic on, a lot of folks, because of the pandemic, wanted to take it online. So we're not doing the class live, but people can take it online in that they can watch it the next day. So the reason we have all this equipment is so that we can record it and then put it out on YouTube. Anybody who wants to watch the lectures on YouTube and take the class online, they can do that. So we knew there weren't going to be very many numbers here in the classroom. But I'm glad that you guys are here, so it just helps me at least, too, when I'm giving a lecture, that I'm not just giving it to an empty room. So thank you for being willing to come out. The way that we're going to run the class, it's a 2-hour long class on Thursday nights from 7 to 9. And the way that we're going to do it is start with the lecture. I'm not going to lecture for the entire 2 hours. We're going to start with the lecture, which I'm hoping will be around an hour. It'll probably vary from week to week. And then when I'm done with the lecture, then anybody who's auditing it or anybody watching it online who's not taking it for credit, they can leave. They don't have to stick around for all of the class work that's going to be involved with the class. So student presentations, discussion, Q&A. I mean, people auditing are welcome to stay for that, or people online are welcome to watch that, but they don't have to. Most of the people who are auditing it just want to be here for the lecture part. That's why we're going to start with the lecture and then do all the class work afterwards, probably starting around 8:15. And we'll take a break right at about an hour. We'll take a break around 8 as well, 5-10 minute bathroom break. So normally in a class, we would start by going through the syllabus, right? So everybody's on the same page and they understand the requirements, but we're not going to do that until 8, okay? I'm going to just jump right into the lecture and get going. And then during the second hour of the class, we'll start talking about the mechanics of the class, the logistics, the homework, the readings, et cetera, et cetera. So now what I would encourage you to do is get out something to take notes on. So just something you can write down, things that you're learning, things that I put on the PowerPoint, things that you want to write down for later. Let me just start off telling you a little bit about me, and most of you here in the room know me fairly well, but especially for folks online who are going to watch this later, I'll describe just a little bit about me. My name is Adam Johnson. And I became a Christian when I was about 17 years old. So I grew up in the church and believed in God, believed in the Bible, all that stuff. But a fellow teenager named Iris talked to me one day, and she asked me a question that changed my life. She said, if you were standing before God right now and he asked you, why should I let you into heaven, what would you say? And I told Iris, well, God would let me in because I'm a pretty good person. I never murdered anybody, never robbed a bank. And she went on to share the gospel with me and explain that that's not good enough. That according to God, according to Jesus, the Bible, Matthew 5:48, somebody has to be perfect in order to earn their way into heaven. And I said, well, nobody's perfect. I was a little frustrated. She said, that's exactly right. Because none of us are perfect, God sent Jesus to live the perfect life that we couldn't, and then to die on the cross to pay the penalty we deserve for our moral failures. She said, I had faith, I was trusting in something, but I was trusting in the wrong thing. I was trusting in myself, what I could do to earn my way to heaven. And so she encouraged me to trust in Jesus instead. And so that's the night, February 4th, 1994, that I became a Christian. Now, all throughout my 20s, I struggled with my faith. I had a lot of doubts and questions whether Christianity was really true or not. And it all kind of came to a head in my late 20s when I had a crisis of faith, if you will. And it was through that crisis of faith that God called me into ministry, because I got exposed to this Christian philosophy and apologetics, and in particular Francis Schaeffer's works. And that helped me through my crisis of faith, and then it became clear that I should be serving others the way that Francis Schaeffer served me. And so God used that to call me into ministry. We moved down to South Carolina, and for 10 years we lived in South Carolina. I went to seminary there, I was a pastor, Southern Baptist pastor in South Carolina. But even as a pastor, I wanted to do more work in apologetics, this area of giving good reasons and evidence to believe that Christianity is true. So I stepped down from being a pastor in 2017 to work full-time for a ministry called Ratio Christi. And that's who I work full-time for now. And it's a campus ministry, kind of like Cru or RUF, Navigators, but we focus on more of these academic issues, philosophical, scientific, and historical reasons to believe that Christianity is true. I started working on my PhD in this area, philosophy of religion, and just finished that this year. Graduated in May with my PhD. So my contact information, I have this on the syllabus, but let me write it up on the board for you as well. If there's anything you need from me for the class, you can email me. That's always the best way to get a hold of me. And what I'll give you is just a simple one. It's Adam Johnson at ratiochristi.org. And then we have a TA for the class. I'm really excited. Caleb Swanson volunteered to be the class's TA, so he will be the one who actually you'll probably be interacting with the most, even those of you taking it online, because he'll be the one who is taking attendance, who is grading your work, and writing the exams and all that stuff. So with all the logistics of the class, Caleb will be the go-to person, and his email address is over there on the top. It's calebistheTA@gmail.com.
Very advanced, yes.
So I'm very thankful for Caleb, and I think that will make the class run a lot better to have us both working on this stuff. So that'll allow me to concentrate on the lectures, that'll allow me to concentrate on the content. Clearly, if you have any questions about that, reach out to me. But if you have questions about the logistics of the class, reach out to Caleb, and we'll go over more of those logistics during the second hour. Okay, well, let's start off with just a basic, simple thing. What is philosophy? So what is philosophy? It's a word that we use in English that comes from two Greek words. So like most of our English words, they come from the Greek language. And in Greek, philo means love. You might think of like Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And then the second part of the word, Sophie, philosophy, comes from the Greek root word Sophia, which means knowledge. So basically the term philosophy was used even back in ancient Greek just to mean learning or knowledge, the love of knowledge. So we want to learn things, we want to understand things. Philosophy was a very broad term that was used for all subjects. And sometimes we still use it that way today. For example, you can get a PhD, which is Doctor of Philosophy, in biology. So you're getting a doctorate of philosophy, a doctorate of learning in the field of biology. You could get a PhD in literature. So you're getting a terminal degree, a Doctor of Philosophy, in literature. And so we still use philosophy sometimes today in that broad sense, just meaning all sorts of learning, all sorts of subjects. But what happened through history, even though the term philosophy started out being used that way, what happened down through history is that certain subjects got spun off. As various subjects grew, they kind of became their own thing. So for example, science, when we had the scientific revolution, whereas science just used to be one of the subjects under philosophy, like all subjects were, science eventually kind of became its own thing. And this happened for the vast majority of subjects, like history. History eventually became its own thing and broke out underneath the umbrella of philosophy. And then all the other academic subjects we have eventually broke out too. And so nowadays, we usually use the term philosophy to refer to a very specific academic subject, okay? So in the past, it was used more generally to mean all sorts of learning, all sorts of knowledge. Now it's kind of been reduced to just a few core things. Now we use the term in other ways in our culture as well. Sometimes we use it just to talk about maybe our way of going about things. Like you might have a certain philosophy when it comes to buying a car. Maybe you always lease your vehicle. You might have a different philosophy when it comes to cars. You might always buy brand new cars. Whereas maybe somebody else always buys a car that's 5 or 6 years old and then drives it until it dies. So you could be, we could talk about different car buying philosophies that we have. Sometimes it's used that way too. Sometimes it's used as just a worldview or somebody's perspective on life. But in this class, we're going to be using it in that specific way to mean this specific academic subject. So a lot of subjects have been stripped out, history, science, but there's just a few core subjects left under the umbrella of what people call philosophy today. And there's three of those main topics that are left that haven't spun off. But before I give you those 3 topics, I think it's better to illustrate what these 3 topics are with a question. So let me pose a question to you guys and we can just interact for a minute here. Here's the question. What is more real? The love that I have for my wife, and if you guys know me, you know that I love my wife. You'll have to trust me here. What's more real? The love that I have for my wife or this chair right here? Use an actual physical chair we can all see and touch. So how would you respond to this question? What do you think? What is more real?
Could it be that it might be helpful to define what you mean by real?
I'm going to let you.
Oh, you're going to let, okay.
I'm going to let you, how would you respond to the question?
Ah, okay.
Bring your own definition of real to the table. How would you respond to this? And the reason I'm doing this is so we can flesh out what these 3 topics are.
I'd probably say the chair just based on the fact that we can quantify that it's there. You said we have to trust you that the love for your wife is there, but we don't have to trust you that the chair is there.
Okay, and that's a very common response. That's what most people would say, especially in our Western culture, is that this chair is more real. Because I can touch it, because I can see it, and the love, even though, I said just assume that I do love my wife, that is less tangible maybe. And we can't see, we can't touch, we can't smell love. And so most people, especially in our Western, modern, scientific, we rely much more on our senses to determine what's real, and we trust those more. So that is the common response, especially in our modern Western scientific culture, to say the chair is more real. But I use this question, it's kind of a silly question, but it helps illustrate the 3 main topics in philosophy. Thankfully, they all start with the letter E, so that makes them easy to remember. So the first topic in philosophy is existence. What exists? What does it mean to exist? Or like Caleb said, what does it mean to be real? Existence. Sometimes this is called ontology, sometimes this is called metaphysics. Big fancy words, they just mean the same thing. Existence. What really exists? Where did things come from? How can they exist? What causes them to exist? It's these sort of issues that play a huge role in the modern, academic study of philosophy. The second topic that hasn't been broken off yet, the second topic that's still under the umbrella of academic philosophy is epistemology. Now, that's kind of a big word, but it also comes from the Greek language. And it just means, sometimes we'll see just the first part of it a lot, especially in the New Testament, because the first part of it just means to believe or to know or to trust something. So epistemology is the study of how we know things. And we thought about that a little bit when I asked the question about love and the chair. It's like, okay, how do we know if something's real or not? Should we trust our senses? Can we trust our senses? Can we trust something if I say that I love my wife? Can you trust testimony of that sort? How do we know what is true? How do we know what is real? How do we know anything? So epistemology is the study of human knowledge. Just how can we learn? How can we know things? That's what epistemology is all about. And the last topic in philosophy is ethics. Now this is, in a sense, this is kind of spun off to be its own subject, right? So even if you go to a university or a college, you can take a class in philosophy, you can take a class in ethics. And usually in ethics, what you're going to study is what's called normative ethics. You know, the right or wrong of something. So like abortion. Is abortion right or wrong? Is the death penalty right or wrong? Those sort of normative ethical issues have been broken off and has become its own subject. But what still remains within philosophy is more the issue of metaethics, which is really the first two topics just applied to ethics. So we can talk about the existence of ethics. Do ethical truths exist? Or are they just personal opinions? The epistemology of ethics would be asking, you know, how do we know moral truths? How do we know what is right or wrong? So there's still this aspect of ethics which fits under the umbrella of philosophy. Well, did anybody not like the question? Did anybody see any mistakes with the question, or just dislike it, or think? So I'm going to jump back to just how some people might not like the question and point out that the question itself might be illogical. And that just goes to show that logic is a very important aspect in philosophy. So in all of these three topics, we're going to be using logic, reason, sometimes people call it critical thinking. So philosophy can be a very useful subject just as like brain exercise. People often say this about mathematics as well. People, complain, I'm never going to use math again. But the point a lot of times with math and philosophy is that it's good brain exercise. It develops good logical thinking skills. It's kind of like lifting weights. Who's ever going to do this motion again? Bench or squat. I'm never going to do that again. Well, no, it's not because you're going to do that exact same motion, but you're building muscle through those things that you'll use in other areas. Same thing with math and philosophy. You're exercising your brain, getting it better so that you can apply it to maybe whatever you do in life. Being a lawyer, being an accountant, being a pastor, etc., etc. So logic, critical thinking, reasoning is always a very important part of philosophy. Now what we're going to do mostly in this class is I'm going to present an overview of the history of philosophy. So we're going to be walking through just the history of Western philosophy. And if that sounds a little bit intense, just think of it this way. It's basically what we're doing is we're looking at the history of Western thinking. We're looking at the history of our culture's ideas. To try to ask ourselves, why does our culture nowadays think the way it does? Where did these ideas come from throughout history? I think especially for us as Christians, this is a Christian philosophy class. For us as Christians, this is important for us to know because we want to try to understand what has led Western culture away from God. Why do many people conclude in our culture nowadays that there is no God or that God is dead? How did we get into this postmodern mess? What are Western people turning to instead of God these days? Because the better we understand our culture in its thinking and why it thinks the way it does, the better we know how to communicate and reach it for Christ. Now, one of the biggest issues that our culture is struggling with right now is how to find a basis, a foundation, if you will, for meaning and morality. What's the meaning of life? Is there anything, is morality real? Or is it just relative or subjective? So I'm going to share with you a few quotes here real quick from some key thinkers. Some of them a few decades ago, some of them just very contemporary within the last 5 or 10 years. So this is a large part of where our Western culture is right now in their thinking. So take a look at this first quote. This is from a French scientist, Jacques Monod. He was one of the founders of molecular biology, won the Nobel Prize. He said that anything can be reduced to simple, obvious mechanical interactions. The cell is a machine, animal is a machine, man is a machine. The universe isn't pregnant with life, nor the biosphere with man. Man at last knows he's alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe, out of which he emerged merely by chance. His destiny is nowhere spelled out, nor is his duty. A few more quotes just to give you an idea of some of the thought that's in our culture right now, struggling with morality and meaning. This is Bertrand Russell, also won the Nobel Prize. He's one of the founders of analytic philosophy. Everybody agrees he's one of the premier logicians, experts in logic of the 1900s. He said that man is the product of causes which had no foresight, of the end that they were achieving. His origin, his growth, hopes, fears, loves, beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. We're just a bunch of atoms, molecules bouncing around accidentally. The next one, Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most famous atheist right now. He wrote this in one of his books. He said, "We, human beings, are just survival machines. We're robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." This is a truth which still fills me with astonishment. I've known it for years, but I can't seem to fully get used to it. Imagine that. 2 more real quick. This is Michael Roos. He is a professor down at Florida State University. He said about morality, he said, Darwinian theory shows that in fact morality is a function of subjective feelings. But it also shows that we have and must have the illusion of objective morality. In a sense, therefore, morality is a collective illusion foisted upon us by our genes. No wonder that our culture is struggling with meaning and morality. And then the last one, I really appreciate this quote. It's very honest, I think. This is John Searle. He's a philosophy professor at Berkeley that I have a lot of respect for. He wrote, "The central question in philosophy at the beginning of the 21st century, so not too long ago, is how to give an account of ourselves as apparently conscious, mindful, free, rational speaking, social, political agents in a world that science tells us consists entirely of mindless, meaningless physical particles. Who are we then? And how do we fit into the rest of the world? How does the human reality relate to the rest of reality?" One special form of this question is, what does it mean
to be human. So I think that gets at the heart of the issue of what Western culture is struggling with. So as Christians, we want to ask things like, well, how did we get here? What brought us to this point, to these conclusions as a culture? Because it didn't happen overnight. There's been a progression of ideas and thoughts and movements that has brought us to this point. I like to use this graph, especially those of you who are into math. You work a lot with graphs, right? And oftentimes, when you zoom in, look at the picture on the left, when you zoom in, it's kind of hard to tell where things are going. Could be trending downward, could be trending upward. There's a lot of back and forth, just not sure where things are going. But if you zoom out a little bit, and that's the picture on the right, if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, you can see that this trend is definitely moving in a certain direction. Now I don't even know what these graphs are about. I'm just using them as examples to make the point that the history of philosophy is the same way. So when we zoom into a certain, even a century, there might be a lot of back and forth movement here, there, ebb and flow. But if we can step back and look at, what we'll do in this class is look at several thousand years of Western thinking. And I think when you do that, it's fairly obvious that there's a certain trajectory that it's on, a certain flow to the ideas of one influencing the next, and so on and so forth. Now we're all shaped by the culture that we grow up in, right? So we've all grown up, as far as I know, here in Western culture, and so we all kind of have adopted Western thinking. That's just how humanity works. If you would have grown up in the East, for example, China, Japan, in more of an Oriental country, you would think quite different, because you would have inherited a lot of thinking of that culture. Now we're not stuck in our cultural ideas. Obviously, when we reach a certain age, we should start reflecting on the ideas in our culture and then try to ascertain whether what we've been taught in our culture from our parents, from our teachers, is really correct or not. And that's, the growing pains and the coming of age that we all go through. But we all start out within a culture, and we are given certain beliefs. But as we grow up, we need to evaluate those and see if they are correct. Now what happens, and when you read Francis Schaeffer, he'll talk a lot about this, and I'll mention this in class quite a bit as well. But the way that it usually works, not always, but most times the way it works is that the big ideas will start at a high level. Maybe some philosophers, maybe some scientists, maybe some theologians will have some ideas, and they'll be fairly complex, and not many people will even understand them. But usually who picks them up next are the artists of a culture. So artists of a culture will pick up the big ideas that are being generated, maybe at a higher level, and then they'll communicate those ideas down to the masses through their various forms of art. And when I say art, don't just think of like paintings on a wall. When I talk about art, I'm talking about, in our day, movies, songs, TV shows. It does include paintings, sculptures, novels, literature, poetry, sermons even. All of those are art forms that communicate a message. Because let's face it, not many people are reading the very high level ideas in philosophy, but that's usually where the new ideas start, and then they trickle down to the masses through the artists. And we'll see that time and time again throughout history. So the artists have a large role to play in this, for good or for evil. Well, back again, let's think for ourselves as Christians, this is a Christian philosophy class, why we would want to study this stuff. Why do we want to study the history of Western ideas? For one reason, we want to protect ourselves from bad ideas, right? Some of the quotes that I put up there, we want to protect ourselves and the church right? From bad ideas, other Christians. We want to protect them from bad philosophy, if you will. But also to know how to reach our culture for Christ. We've talked about this a little bit. And some people will say to me, when they're taking this class or when I'm just talking with them, they'll say, well, I know why our culture moved away from God. I know why our culture rejected Christianity. Well, it's just sin. It's just sin and rebellion. And of course that's the right answer, but I think we should want to know more. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a loved one. It's your daughter, it's your girlfriend, it's your best friend, somebody you love in the world. And they're a Christian, you're a Christian, but you don't see them for a while. Maybe you're separated, they move off to college, let's say, and you're away from them for a while. And then you find out that they have rejected Christianity. Now you're troubled by this, you're bothered by this, and you want to know why. Let's say you were talking to them on the phone and they said, yeah, I don't believe in Christianity anymore. I don't think you would say, well, the reason is because of sin and rebellion. Hang up the phone and go water your garden. Right? Of course that's the right answer, sin and rebellion, but I think you would stay on the phone and you would ask them, well, what happened? What brought you to this point? You would want to know some history. I haven't seen you for a year. What has happened over this last year that has led you to this point? What are some ideas? What brought you to this conclusion? So, in other words, you're going to want to know the history of this last year with her and the ideas that have caused her to move this direction. Maybe they got involved, or maybe she got involved at a new church and they were really judgmental towards her. And so she got very hurt by that and rejected Christianity. Well, you'd want to know that so you can know how to help her. Or maybe she had her roommate was raped in college. And she's wondering, how could there be a God who would allow something like this? And maybe that's why she rejected Christianity. You would want to know the history of ideas so you would know how to respond and help her. And I'll tell you, however much you would love this hypothetical person, God loves the lost 1,000,000 times more. And we should too. So I think it behooves us as Christians to want to know, yes, it's sin and rebellion that has caused our culture to move away from Christianity, but what history of ideas have led them there so that we can help. So we can help point them back to Christ. We're just covering some basics tonight as to why this stuff is important to begin with. Another example I like to use often is, let's say you're going to be a missionary to India. So you're going to be a missionary to India, you want to prepare for that, and mostly what you would be doing is studying the Bible, theology, how to share the gospel, those sort of things. That would be what you would mostly do to be prepared to be a missionary to India. But you would also want to spend a little bit of time at least studying the culture of India, their language, their ideas, their history, so that you know how to best reach them for Christ. And I always say, if you're a Christian, by definition, you are a missionary. Christ gave us all the Great Commission to go out and make disciples. So if you are a Christian, you're a missionary. And if you live here in the West, then you're a missionary to West, the Western culture, Europe and America. And so I think it, again, behooves us to try to understand our culture as best as we can. Now, I will say, before we start diving into the details here in this class, history is really, really messy. And it can be overwhelming at first. All these names and names of people, names of movements, dates. Just the study of history can be overwhelming. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed with those sort of details, because honestly, those sort of details aren't as important. To me, I don't think they should be as important to you. What's more important, and what I want you to understand, are the ideas. So even if you forget the person who came up with the idea, just the fact that you understand and can conceive and understand the idea and how it shaped our culture, that's going to be more important. So when Caleb is making the exams, he's going to be focusing more on the ideas instead of the names and the dates.
Yeah.
Now, names and dates are important. I mean, those, we just don't ignore those things, but the ideas are more important.
So, Adam, if I can ask a quick question. So you mean it's more important to you the ideas that come from India rather than what year they became independent or something like this?
That's a good example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in order to do that, I'm going to teach the class as a story. Okay? So instead of just, giving you names, dates every week, I'm going to teach it more as a story. Because I think that's going to be more helpful, it'll be more easy for you to remember, and it's going to concentrate on the ideas in the story instead of the names and the dates per se. And this is the story that I'm going to tell you. It's a story about the search for ultimate answers. This is what the class is all about. You'll see this slide probably 1,000 times. A story about the search for ultimate answers. Now, because it's a story, it's going to cause me to overgeneralize a little bit. So you can understand the flow. I'm going to oversimplify and maybe overgeneralize sometimes, not get down into the nitty-gritty, so that you can grasp the big story. Okay, so those watching, maybe who have some background in philosophy, you'll notice when I overgeneralize. I'll try not to, build a straw man. I'll try to be fair to the people that we're looking at and reflect them as accurately as possible, but I will overgeneralize sometimes, just to give you some forewarning. So when I say ultimate answers, these are the questions that I'm calling ultimate. So what is the meaning of life? I mean, I don't know, I can get a bigger question than that. What is our purpose? And then the second one, how do we figure out the right answers? And you might remember this fits exactly with the first two topics in philosophy, right? The first one is existence, right? Where do we come from? What's our purpose? Why do we exist? And the second one is epistemology. How do we know things? How do we know the right answers to this question? Now, kind of a subplot to this story is the interaction of faith and reason. So if this is the main story, the search for the ultimate answers, this is kind of a subplot to the story, the interaction of faith and reason. How faith and reason have worked together or sometimes separately to try to answer number two. So how do we get the right answers? Do we use faith? Do we use reason? Do we use a combination of the two? And that's going to be a big part of the story. You might be wondering, why is faith and reason so important? Well, one of the reasons, at least in our Western culture, that these two things, reason and faith, play such a big role is that our Western culture has largely been shaped by these two movements. Whether you know that or not, whether people in our culture know this, it's just a fact. I mean, we've already seen just a lot of our language comes from Greek, right? But much, much more than just our language. A lot of our Western thinking comes from the ancient Greek world, Greek philosophy in particular. And who I'm talking about there, of course, are like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the big three, but there were many other Greek philosophers. And a lot of our cultural thinking, our political thinking, our economic thinking, our scientific thinking, stems from Greek philosophy. And we'll see that often. And of course, the other big movement that has shaped Western culture is Christianity, whether you like it or not, or whether you know it or not. A lot of our thinking over the last 2,000 years has come from the movement of Christianity. And the interaction of these two things, Greek philosophy and Christianity. That's why this is such an important subplot to the main story. Now, one thing that I don't like about this picture, even though it's often presented like this, I don't like this, and this is actually, as I'll argue in the class, one of the major problems, is that Christianity is referred to as just a faith thing. So you see this often in philosophy classes. Greek philosophy is all about reason. Christianity is all about faith. Faith and reason have played a big part in our culture, so on and so forth. But I think right here is the problem. And I'll say this a million times in the class. This idea that Christianity is merely about faith. I think a much more accurate illustration is that Christianity is about faith and reason. So what you find within Christianity is faith and reason. Now certainly, the Greeks, they excelled in reason, logic, rationality. But we don't want to view Christianity as just merely faith. That's a huge part of the problem. And I'll try to explain that as we go through the class. That it's imperative that we see Christianity as faith and reason working together. It's actually when faith and reason are broken apart, that's when things get off track. And I'm going to make the case in this class that a lot of the problems that we've picked up over the centuries, a lot of our cultural problems, the bad ideas that our culture has developed, is because faith and reason has been broken apart. Now, one of the things we'll see is that when they're first broken apart, we're going to start at a time in history where faith and reason were working together. They were good buds. They were good friends. They were working together. We're going to start there in history, but we're soon going to see as we walk through Western history that they get broken apart. And at first, they're broken apart but still friendly towards each other. But as we walk down Western history, eventually we'll see that they become enemies. And that's how most people view faith and reason nowadays, is opposites, enemies. Both in the church and outside of the church. Christians and non-Christians think of faith and reason as opposites, as enemies. So we're going to see what happens when reason goes down a path by itself. I'm going to argue that it hits a dead end, causes a lot of problems in our thinking. And then we're going to see a path of faith trying to go down a path by itself and see what kind of problems that causes. And that might sound a little bit strange to you if you're a Christian, but you'll understand more what I mean by that as we go through this. I'll give you an example. I think this might help you understand what I'm getting at here. So, I've got somebody really close in my life who grew up going to church, and they started to have some of the questions that I had in my 20s, just like, how do we know that Christianity is true? How do we know the Bible is historically reliable? How does science and Christianity fit? Because they don't seem to. Science at school is telling me all about these dinosaurs. I don't see any dinosaurs in the Bible. That doesn't seem to fit here. And so they went to their pastor and started asking these questions, and the pastor told them, don't ask questions like that, just believe. And so that would be a bad example of faith and reason being broken apart, faith going down a path by itself, and it leading to some problems. Because that person, said, okay, well, if that's the way it is, I don't want to have anything to do with it. So that's just one practical example. Sometimes I use this picture to illustrate reason without faith is kind of like tires without the car. And then faith without reason is kind of like having the car but then no tires. So I'm going to be making the case throughout the whole class that the way that God intended it to be was that faith and reason should work together. Now we just got a few minutes left, so why don't we actually take our break now? And when we come back, I want to start looking at some of the handouts with you. So Caleb and I aren't going to print the handouts for you. If you want them printed, you're free to do that. Caleb will email you the handouts throughout the week, every week that you need them. You can print them out if you need to, or if you'd rather just look at them on your phone or on your computer, that's fine. But you need to have them in front of you in some way, shape, or form in class, because we're going to be talking about the handouts in class. So you got to have it in front of you in some way, shape, or form, either printed or electronically. Okay, so pull out this chart. This will be very useful, I think, for you all throughout the semester. I tried to summarize the entire class just on one chart. And so I just want to walk through the chart with you now, and then we'll refer to it all throughout the class. You can almost use this as like a roadmap. Where we're at, what we've discussed so far, where we're going. But you can see the way that I've labeled it here at the top, the search for ultimate answers. And those of you online, this is on the spreadsheet that I sent out, that Caleb sent out for us. So the search for ultimate answers. What is the meaning and purpose of life? And you can see over here on the left, I've organized Western culture into three large sections. The pre-modern era, the modern era, and the post-modern era. And you've probably heard those terms before. Those are very common in our culture right now, these pre-modern, modern, post-modern eras. And again, I'm overgeneralizing here, okay, just to make it simple. And then I've put 2 stages within each era. So you can see there's 6 total stages. And I put an approximate timeline for each stage. But I'm sure, as you guys know, these sort of ideas, it's not like everybody on January 1st of the year 1600, everybody moved from the pre-modern to the modern way of thinking. Obviously, that's not how it works, right? These ideas start very small, they grow, the artists pick up on them and communicate them down through their various forms of art, and then eventually they become the way the majority of people in the culture think. But it takes time. So these timelines that I'm giving you are very, very approximate, just round numbers, so you can just get a basic feel for the era that we're talking about. So, starting here now about the answers. I think this will be really helpful for you the way that I try to break this down on the chart. So, the answers we're talking about are the ultimate answers, right? The meaning and purpose of life. And you'll see, for example, in the first stage, stage number 1, most people thought that the ultimate answers came from God. That's where the answers came from. And they're found in God's revelation. So you can see that over here on the chart. The answers, they come from God, and they're found in His revelation. Both special revelation, Scripture, the Bible, and general revelation, His creation. Sometimes we call it nature, right? That's where the answers are found. Well, how do we find them? How do we find them? They're discovered through faith and reason. Faith and reason working together to discover the answers in Scripture and nature, but ultimately that the answers come from God, the supreme being. So you'll see as we move down the various stages, these things change. And what I mean is that the majority of the culture, the majority of people in the culture shift in the way that they think about these things. So in stage 2, what changed?
reason became more important.
Yeah, not a big change yet, but just way over here to the right, the only thing that's different from stage 2 and stage 1 is that reason starts to take a little bit more of an emphasis. Okay, so the way I illustrated that was by putting faith and reason, faith first, then reason, but in stage 2, reason first, then faith. When we get to stage 3, what we call the modern era, answers still come from God, and they still come from His revelation, but only His revelation through nature. Anybody know what that's called? Sometimes it's referred to as deism.
Oh.
Deists believe that there is a God, but that the only way He communicates is through creation, the way He created things. He doesn't communicate to us directly through any sort of scripture. So deists are theists. They believe in God, but they only believe that He communicates to us through nature and reason. So we'll see at the beginning of the modern era that reason becomes king. Reason completely swallows up faith, and reason, understanding God's will through reason alone, by itself. See, we're kind of going down this path now in history. Stage 4, we move on in the modern era. What's the big change here from stage 3 to stage 4?
Answers are only found in nature.
Yeah, so nature now has grown and ate up God. God has kind of been moved out of the picture in the later modern era. Not everybody, of course, right? It's not like all the pre-modern thinkers have disappeared. I mean, I would consider myself a pre-modern thinker. I think in pre-modern terms. I believe God. I believe the answers come from God. I believe they're found in both His special and general revelation. But the majority of the culture then, by the time we hit the 1800s, the majority of Western people think in this way, that the answers, the ultimate answers, come from nature itself. Nature is where the answers come from. The universe, the world, however you want to say it. That's where they're found in nature, and we use reason to discover them. But this is a very interesting stage now, what I've referred to as the postmodern era. This is 5 and 6. What happens when reason tries to go down this path by itself, it hits a huge dead end. And we'll see this happen in all sorts of ways. That this path, reason by itself, just hits this huge dead end and almost implodes on itself. Okay? And that leads us into what I'm calling here the postmodern era. So number 5, stage 5, by the time we're getting to the mid to late 1800s, the vast majority of people are concluding that there are no ultimate answers. They just don't exist. You can ask the question, that's fine, what's the meaning of life, what's the purpose of life, but there's no answers. Reason has completely, is bankrupt here. Reason won't help at all to discover these ultimate answers, meaning, purpose of life. They're nowhere to be found. Reason is just a dead end. And that's kind of a crushing blow. We'll see for how a lot of people, especially the artists, this is just crushing to them. And suicide and frustration and existential crises. I mean, this is just, when reason hits this dead end, it's devastating to our culture. But then what happens is that we shift. We find out that this was a dead end, and so we try this path instead. Instead of going back here to faith and reason working together, we just jump off of this path and start trying this path. faith by itself. Now again, I'm overgeneralizing here, but I'm doing it to try to simplify and help you understand kind of this path of ideas through history. And a lot of times, especially Christians, Protestants, they're concerned about what I mean. How could faith be a bad thing, or faith by itself? How could that be a bad thing? Isn't faith a good thing? Well, by the time we get over here, faith is being used not how we often think of it in the church as Christians, but faith, and I'm going to argue this happens when faith is broken apart from reason, is faith becomes more of a feeling or an emotion or just simply your will or your choices. Well, why do you believe that? Well, because I choose to. Well, why do you believe that? Well, it's just because I feel like it's true. I have a strong passion or a strong desire. Well, do you have any reasons? No. Reasons, that was a dead end. Reasons doesn't help when it comes to the ultimate. Yeah, maybe it helps when we're developing technology or medication or science, right? Reason's helpful. But when it comes to the ultimate answers, it's about how you feel on the inside. And that's what faith becomes when it's broken off from reason. It just becomes more about how you feel. And that takes us to stage 6 then. So in the chart, stage 6, now we're getting into the 1900s. Where do the ultimate answers come from? Well, they come from us. We create, I choose the meaning to life, my life. I create my own meaning. Where are the answers? They're found inside of me, or us. Sometimes we say it in that way. Our culture creates the answers. The meaning of life is ultimate answers. Reason is a dead end, so it's your feelings or your choices or your will that is how we discover the ultimate answers. And that's what I'm describing as this path by itself. And I think it'll become more clear when we get there in history, but I'm just trying to give you an overview right now. So this chart will be really helpful for you, and then I'll put this on the board probably every week just to kind of give us, sometimes I also do this with the stages. So like 1 and 2 are up here, right? And then 3, we're moving down this path. 4, we're moving down this path. Boom, we hit a dead end over here on this path. And then we jump over here, and this path is stage 6. So do you see that progression? I do this especially for those that are visual learners. So I know I'm just talking about a lot of concepts right now, but hopefully visually with this chart and these 2 paths will give you a better idea of the flow that I'm trying to lay out. Okay, let's, as I said, we were going to start here in history where faith and reason are working together. So let's start off as Christians. We're here in stage 1. We believe the ultimate answers come from God, and they're found in God's revelation, both scripture and nature. And we discover these answers through faith and reason. So if we're going to take this path, if we're in stage 1, then the answer to the ultimate questions is that we were created for personal loving relationships. So according to pre-modern thinkers, stage 1, stage 2, we were created to love God and to love others. As Jesus said, the greatest commandments. We were created to glorify God by loving, imaging Him, reflecting Him, because He's loving. So that's our purpose, that's the meaning of life, That's what we're here for. How do we discover that? Well, it's about faith and reason working together so we can understand how God has communicated that to us, both through Scripture and nature. So what I want to do now is pull out this other handout. And I want to run through just a few of these verses. We're not going to go through all of them, but I wanted you to have them as a reference. And these would be verses that I would use to show how God has communicated to us that faith and reason should work together. Okay? What does the Bible say about faith and reason? Now let me just give you a really simple example so you understand what I'm talking about. Because I would say that faith and reason should work together not only when it comes to the ultimate answers, but really everything in our life. Every decision we make, every belief that we have, faith and reason are working together. So, a very simple example I often use is when you choose to marry someone, right? So when you make that decision to enter into, a marriage relationship, it is a decision of trust, right? There's faith there. You're trusting the person to love you. You're trusting them to be faithful to you. Now, you don't know with absolute certainty that they're going to do those things, right? We're not omniscient. We're not God. We're finite creatures. So we don't know with absolute certainty that this person we're marrying is going to love us and be faithful to us. So it's a relationship of trust, right? We're deciding to trust that person. But it's not a blind trust. It's not a blind faith. That would be faith all by itself. And what that would look like is if I just walked down the street and closed my eyes and pointed to somebody and said, I'm going to blindly take a leap of faith and trust that person and marry that person. Nobody does that. Even an arranged marriage doesn't work that way. In an arranged marriage, maybe the parents choose your spouse, but you're trusting that they're making a good decision. It's not a blind faith. Well, no, when we choose to make that decision to trust in our spouse, it's based on good reasons and evidence. We've dated them, or our parents have looked into them if it's an arranged marriage. We've been engaged. We've seen how they treat other people. We see how they treat us. We've gotten to know the person, in other words. And so when we enter that decision of trust on our marriage day, we're making a decision, a choice to trust them, but it's not a blind faith. It's not a blind decision of trust. It's based on good reasons and evidence. And you see how this isn't a cold, hard, calculating decision. It's very personal. Because we've dated them, we've got to know them as a person. It's not like we're doing some sort of a calculation, but our reason is working and aiding us in making that trust decision. Does that make sense? And this is how we function as finite creatures. Everything we do works like this. So the mechanic that we choose, do we know with absolute certainty they're a good mechanic? They're not going to take advantage of us. They're going to fix our car, not put a bomb in it. Well, no, we can't know those things with absolute certainty. We're not God. We're not omniscient. So we're making a decision to trust our mechanic, but we make that decision based on good reasons and evidence. Maybe we ask our friends which mechanic they trust. Maybe we would look up the guy and see, or gal, and see their background, where they got their education, if there's any bad reports about them. So we're making a decision of trust, but it's based on good reasons and evidence. And that's what I'm saying the Bible teaches, that faith and reason work like that. So of course the Bible tells us to trust in Jesus, have faith in Jesus, trust in God, believe in God, have faith in God. But the Bible's not asking us to do that blindly. It gives us good reasons and evidence to trust, to have faith in God, faith in Christ. So the way that I think the Bible explains faith is that faith is a decision to trust that is based on good reasons and evidence. What I wrote over here on the PowerPoint right now. And all these verses are verses I would use to make this point. Okay? So all these verses, and you can look them up on your own time, but I use these verses to make that argument. That's how God tells us faith and reason should work together. So let me just give you a summary of some of these verses. Like I said, we're not going to look at them, but you might remember what happens in Exodus 4, right? That's the first set of verses there, Exodus 4. This is a situation where God appears to Moses at the burning bush and sends Moses down to the Israelites to tell them, hey, I'm going to rescue you from Egypt. The Israelites are slaves in Egypt at that point, and God's going to rescue them through this man Moses. God's telling Moses this through the burning bush, and Moses has a few objections, you might remember. And one of his objections, he says, God, what if they don't believe that I really heard from you? What if they just think, really? God spoke to you? There was a bush that was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. What were you smoking up on the mountain, Moses? I mean, what if they don't believe that I really heard from God? That was one of Moses' concerns. And notice, if you look at those verses, notice what God doesn't say. God doesn't just say to tell the Israelites to trust you. Just have faith. Just a blind leap of faith. That's not what God tells Moses to do, to tell the Israelites. In fact, God gives Moses good reasons and evidence to give the Israelites, so that they will know he really had heard from God. It's still going to be a decision of trust and faith on the Israelites' part, right? Because they don't know with absolute certainty they really heard from God. They're not omniscient. They don't know everything. So it's still going to be a decision of trust and faith on the parts of the Israelite. But God gives Moses some reasons and evidence to give them to base their faith on. In other words, faith, a decision to trust that's based on good reasons and evidence. And what is the evidence? God uses the term evidence in those verses. Does anybody remember what is the evidence that God gives Moses to give the Israelites?
Water turned to blood.
Yeah, some miracles to do. One of them is throw the staff on the ground, turns into a snake, pick the snake back up, turns back into a staff, put the hand in the cloak, pull it out, cancerous, put it back in, pull it back out, it's healed. And the third evidence is when the bus said, throw down some water, and it turns into blood. So God said, here, give them these evidences so they'll know that you really had heard from Yahweh, God. And all throughout the Bible you see this, that people's trust and faith should be based on good reasons and evidence, according to the Bible. And this was pretty much the standard answer for 1,000 years. If you take a look at your chart, stage 1 and stage 2 lasted for a long time. Yeah, there's a little bit of a different emphasis between faith and reason. Sometimes people saw faith a little bit more important than reason. Other times they saw reason more important than faith. But the bottom line is they saw faith and reason working together. They were friends. They worked together. Now what we're going to do next week is take a look at the two biggest names in this era. The two biggest names in the pre-modern era, and that is Augustine and Aquinas. And what I have in this handout are some quotes from Augustine and then some quotes from Aquinas talking about this issue of faith and reason. So you might want to take a look at those quotes for next week. We won't read them in class. I'll let you read them on your own time. But starting next week, we're going to dive into those two thinkers and see how they influenced Western culture. But they're both very big proponents of faith and reason working together. And the last thing I have in terms of the lecture tonight, and sorry, I thought I was going to take an hour, but I'm taking an hour and a half. Last slide, I promise, and that is just what some of you might be asking is, why are we reading Francis Schaeffer? A lot of people probably don't think we should for a philosophy class. Who is this guy, Francis Schaeffer? He wasn't a trained philosopher, so to a lot of trained philosophers, that's the first big no-no, right? He's not a philosopher. No, he wasn't a trained philosopher. However, I think he had a very good understanding of the history of Western thought. He didn't always get the details right, but like I said before, I'm not as worried about the minutiae details. I'm more concerned, and I am for both me and you, to understand the big ideas. And that's what Schaeffer was really good at, in my opinion. It's understanding how Western culture has shifted and changed down through the centuries. Now, Schaeffer was an evangelical Christian, Presbyterian pastor, and missionary. Most of his ministry took place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, both in Europe and in America. Unfortunately, not many people know about Francis Schaeffer today, but I'm trying to change that as best I can. He died in 1984. That's just one of those things, you know, somebody's been gone for 40 years, and he wrote over 20 books. So a lot of people don't know about him, but I think he's very useful for the next generation to be familiar with. I don't agree with everything he says. I think he's got some things wrong, even in his understanding of Western history of philosophy. But big picture, I think he's very useful to read and understand, try to. So that's why in your syllabus, I'm having one of your assigned reading books for the class be at least one book by Francis Schaeffer. So even though he's not a trained professional philosopher, he has caused many thousands of Christians to go into professional philosophy, though. He's one of the reasons why I got a PhD in philosophy, because his books, more than any others, helped me through my crisis of faith when I was in my late 20s. So, well, I'm going to stop lecturing for now. Are there any questions you guys have about what we've covered tonight?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts kind of on, if you kind of look at the different ways of thinking through time, it seems like that it more rapidly changed, and there was less periods of thought, and I would probably attribute some of that to just the age of information, and that we more and more quickly, printing press and then letters, and now with the internet, just more and more quickly exchange information and new ideas. So do you think that is part of that, and that we're kind of at a point now where we're out of this kind of, having certain phases, and now it's just kind of going to be a constant, storm of everyone just sharing their ideas instantly? Or
Yeah, no, I think the first part what you said is exactly right. So those watching online, maybe you didn't hear that. What Will said is, as I pointed out, the first era lasted over 1,000 years, but then later, as you see, it seems like we were changing in our thinking so much more rapidly, and a movement only lasts nowadays maybe a decade or two, and part of that is the information is so much more readily available, and ideas can get passed on so much more quickly. So as I said, it's always a trickle-down effect. The ideas start usually among philosophers, intellectuals. The artists pick up on it, and then the artists communicate it through nowadays movies, TV, radio, songs, literature to the masses. Case in point, I'm reading Grapes of Wrath right now. One of the famous books of American literature, Grapes of Wrath. And I cannot believe how much of it is just propaganda for Marxism. I was picking up on it just, as a book of literature, and I was like, man, this sounds Marxist. Man, this sounds really Marxist. And then finally, at the end of a chapter I was reading today, he starts talking about Marxist revolution. And I'm like, oh, well, I guess I don't have to interpret anymore. He just says it in black and white. So it's just an example of the art, right, that picks up the big ideas from the thinker Marx. I mean, hardly anybody reads Marx himself, right? But the artists pick up on the ideas and then communicate it down to the masses through their art forms and appeal to our hearts and our emotions. And this can be done for good or for evil. And then the vast majority of the culture pick up on those thoughts, ideas, and start moving that direction in their thinking, ideas. But then the other point that you said is, yes, it seems like nowadays it's just like a snowball effect where now we've just got all these ideas mixing up, and there might not even be necessarily a majority because there's just so much change, things happen so rapidly. And while that's true, what I'm trying to do in the class is just simplify it for you guys as much as possible and put things into nice, neat categories, right? Okay, in the 1800s, this is how people thought. In the 1900s, this is how people thought. And it's much more complicated than that. The pre-modern thinkers didn't die off. They're not gone completely. I'm a pre-modern thinker. The modern way of thinking isn't completely died off. There's still modern. A lot of the quotes I gave you early in the lecture were from modern thinkers. I would consider Richard Dawkins thinking in a modern way. But postmodernism is probably the majority of the way, or the majority of people in our culture think in a postmodern way nowadays. But it's a mixture. There's always tug of war, and maybe things will shift back to a pre-modern way of thinking. And there was a lot of fight between the pre-modern and the moderns for a long time. And there's always tug of war, push back and forth, thinkers that try to take us back or push us forward. But there's always going to be that, and I'm just trying to simplify the class to help you understand by breaking it down into more simple stages. But no, you're right, it's like a snowball effect. We pick up ideas, and like a snowball picks up leaves and branches and sticks, and it ends up becoming just a combination of a whole sorts of beliefs. So a lot of times you'll talk to somebody and you'll find out, well, in this area they think in a pre-modern way, but in this area they think in more of a modern way, and in this area of life they think in a postmodern way. And so it's much more confusing than I'm making it in real life. But when you learn something, you just have to kind of break it out and simplify it and put it in categories, just so you can get your mind around it. Good. Any other thoughts, questions? All right, if anybody's auditing the class, you can take off now if you're just watching, if you're just here for the lectures, because now what we're going to start doing is just going through the logistics of the class, the homework, the assignments, and stuff like that. So if you're not taking it for credit, you might just want to stop watching now or take off if you want to. But we are going to keep recording for those of you that are taking it for credit online so that you're aware of all the class logistics. So what I'd like to do is walk through the syllabus. So everybody pull out a copy of the syllabus, and then you'll get a better feel for what you're responsible for in this class. So the syllabus starts out just with basic information, right? Class is being offered through Spurgeon College, which is the Bible college associated with Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary down in Kansas City. They're allowing us to offer this class here in Lincoln and online for folks. And we start tonight, August 20th, and we're going to meet every Thursday night, and the last class will be December 3rd. Okay, so we're going to meet from 7 to 9 every week. There's my contact information there. It's a different email address. Either one will work. One, freedbyjesus@gmail.com, or Adam Johnson @roshachristi.org, the ministry that I work for. Course description, talked about this. We're studying metaphysics, which is the study of existence, epistemology, and ethics. Here's some course objectives. I'll let you read those on your own. These are some of the things we're trying to accomplish in the class. So turn it over to page 2 of the syllabus. These are the 3 textbooks that you're going to have to read. These are mandatory reading for the class. And you'll churn in every week a reading summary of what you've read to prove to us, to give evidence that you have done the reading. So we don't have to blindly trust you.
That's right.
We will trust you, but it will be based on good reasons and evidence in the form of reading summaries. So these are the 3 books. Buy them if you haven't bought them yet. You'll need these. One of them is just called Christian Philosophy. And then you got Francis Schaeffer's book, How Should We Then Live? And then the third one, I think you'll enjoy. I hope you enjoy all 3 of them, but especially this one is written in a fun way. Notes from the Tilt-A-Whirl. All right, then here's the assignments for the class. And this is not even necessarily something that I chose or the seminary chose, but what we have to do for accreditation purposes. We have to make sure the class is robust enough so that it actually qualifies for credit, such that you can earn this credit either at Midwestern, at Spurgeon College, or transfer the credit to other schools, including the University of Nebraska, which I know people have done that, so it's definitely able to be done. So here's the first assignment, and this is the book review. Okay? You'll have to write a 5-page book review of Notes from the Tilt-A-Whirl. Now we're going to talk about the dates and when everything is due after we go through the syllabus. On the schedule, the class schedule, will be all the dates when things are due. So there's not a date here when this is due, it just describes the work you have to do. And it's a 5-page book review. Now I'm not a stickler when it comes to formatting or font, all that stuff, whether it's footnotes or endnotes. I told Caleb when he grades these things not to, worry about that stuff, but look at the content. So yeah, of course we want you to use good grammar so we can understand what you're saying, but we're not going to take points off for those minor issues like that. Just don't do anything crazy, don't use 7-point or 70-point font or something, or 4-point font so small we can't read it, or don't push your margins all the way to the middle so you only have like 5 words on a page, right? It's got to be normal, double-spaced, 12-point font, Times New Roman is the standard, but anything close to that will be just fine. So that's one assignment. The second assignment there are the reading summaries. And I've explained that every week certain students will be required to present their reading summary to the class. And we won't know from week to week who that's going to be. So what these reading summaries are, they don't have to be very in-depth, just a paragraph or 2. You can just do it on one piece of paper, you can write it out, you can type it out, whatever works better for you. But for the reading for the week, you've got to write a paragraph or 2 and bring those with you or email them to Caleb by Thursday, by the next class. So I'll assign reading every week, and you need to read that for the week and write your reading summary and bring it to class. What we'll do then at 8 o'clock after my lecture is we'll put everybody's name in a hat and draw out a name, and then that person will have to give their reading summary. So it might be, you might have to give it 3 weeks in a row. If your name comes out of the hat 3 weeks in a row, we just don't know who it's going to be. But that way we'll give you more motivation to get the reading done and prepare the reading summary, which Caleb will also grade. Even if you don't have to present it to the class, you've got to get it to Caleb. And he's not going to grade this, very tightly. Mostly if you turn it in and he can tell that you did the reading, you're not just making things up or talking about your dog, then he's going to give you 100%.
Oh.
Okay, so it's pretty easy.
So we should email it to him or give it to him in class?
Either way,
Okay.
up to you. If you want to save paper, save trees, then just email it to Caleb. But make sure you have it with you, either on paper or electronically, because if you have to read it to the class, then you need to have it with you, some way, shape, or form. Any questions yet? I know this is just boring syllabus stuff, but we got to talk through it.
Yeah, where do you get the handouts from? Is there a website?
Caleb's emailing them out to everybody. Yep. Are you on the email list, maybe?
I don't think so.
Oh, are you taking it for credit, or are you just auditing it?
I'm taking it for credit.
Okay. Did you register and pay like the $35 and all that stuff?
I registered, but I didn't pay for it
Oh.
yet.
Okay.
I will add you to the email.
Well, make sure he's got your email, and then he'll put you on the list. And you can communicate with him. You can give him your email address by emailing him.
Yeah, Andre, I noticed that the
There you go.
website, Heartland's website, there was supposed to be a link that they were supposed to build in there, and that link doesn't work. Otherwise, you could have probably seen the syllabus and stuff, because it's the website. I've taken classes from them for the last couple of years, and there's usually a link that shows the class schedule and all that stuff. Like when you registered, you should have been able to look at it there, but it just wasn't on there. So yeah, Caleb's the only way we've gotten that.
All right, the third assignment is the historical survey paper. And this is a 5-page paper where you're going to summarize the story of Western philosophy. So this won't be due till the end of the semester. You know, you'll have heard all of my lectures and read all the books. And then in your own words, you need to summarize this story the way we're presenting it, right? So again, 5-page paper, just a very broad survey of these ideas in your own words. The major movements, major schools, figures that we're talking about. Okay, the fourth assignment is the research paper. And this is going to be a longer paper. This has to be at least 8 pages, but 8 to 10 pages. And then you can choose the topic for this, okay? This is a research paper. So maybe a topic that we discuss in class that you want to write on, dive down deeper into it, or as you can see, you can pick something from our culture. Maybe a book you're reading, like I'm reading The Grapes of Wrath. I could write a philosophy paper on the ideas that the author is trying to communicate through that book. Maybe a movie that you've noticed has some philosophical ideas. So this can be fun, this can be interesting to you, something you're excited about, you can write a paper on. Run it by me or Caleb first though. It would be good just to make sure that you're choosing, so if you have questions, I mean obviously if you're going to choose Thomas Aquinas, one of the main figures we're going to talk about next week, that's a no-brainer. Yeah, you can write a research paper on Thomas Aquinas. But if you're thinking of a movie or a book and you're not sure if that will be a good fit or not, ask us and we can tell you. But then the syllabus gives you some examples here of things you could. Even the movie Frozen is used as an example. Some more details about that assignment, ask me or Caleb if you have questions. And then the exams. So the last and the fifth thing that you need to do if you're taking this class for credit are the exams, okay? And they're going to include, true and false, multiple choice, probably focused mostly on essay questions. Again, true and false, multiple choice, that's more about facts, details, dates, names. And I'm more interested in making sure you guys understand these big ideas. And so an essay exam is going to accomplish that the best. So these exams are going to be more essay exams. Now the syllabus gives us, me and Caleb, a lot of freedom to organize the exams and how we're going to do it. But we'll talk about those details when we go through the class schedule. All right, turn over to the next page. I'm now on page 4 of the syllabus. And yeah, anybody else who's watching online who doesn't have the syllabus yet, taking the class for credit, email Caleb, and he'll get you everything you need, the handouts, the syllabus, the class schedule, all that stuff. Okay, the grading scale is the top of page 4, and it's just a standard grading scale that the seminary and the Bible college uses. So we'll do so as well. I'm going to give you that class schedule here. We'll go through it together in just a second. And then I'll let you read the rest of the stuff on your own. It's just standard stuff about, plagiarism is bad. Pay attention to the syllabus. Attendance is important. Take a look at number 4. So your grade will get affected if you miss more than 25% of the classes. So Caleb's going to keep attendance, and even tonight, make sure you know everybody who's here. Who's taking it for credit?
I did.
Okay, good. So we'll take attendance every week and make sure that, because we've got to turn that into the Bible college. Okay, we're getting close to 9, so let's quickly go through the class schedule. And this should be very self-explanatory. I did my best as the professor, as the teacher of the class, just to make it very, very simple for you. So you know exactly what we're doing, when we're doing it, what's due, when it's due, all that stuff. So we don't have to go through the entire thing, but just real quickly, we'll go through it. So like for today, start at the top, August 20th. I wanted you just to take a look at the syllabus and the class schedule before class. Nothing was due today, of course, right? It's the first day of class. And then the lecture that I gave tonight was about just what is philosophy. So that was tonight. Okay. Looking forward to next week, August 27th. You got quite a bit of reading to do, right? In the Christian philosophy book, you've got to read the first 2 chapters. And then in the Tilt-A-Whirl book, you have to read the first 5 chapters. That's a lot of pages. We're talking 90 pages here in a week. And if you wait till the night before, it's going to be too much. I mean, reading 90 pages in an evening is overwhelming. But if you break it down, just read 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 pages a day, which won't take you long at all. You can read 90 pages in a week, no problem. So I would encourage you just to organize yourself, discipline yourself, and read so much, and you'll get done with the reading, no problem. What to do next week? Well, it's your reading summaries, but note, only for the Christian philosophy book. So pay attention to this class schedule so you don't do more work than you need to. You don't need to do a reading summary about the Tilt-A-Whirl book. Only for Christian philosophy. Does that make sense? And then next week I'm going to lecture on faith and reason more, Augustine and Aquinas. And that's just how the rest of the class schedule goes. So every week I lay out what you need to do to prepare for class, what you need to read, what to do, reading summaries, and then what I'm going to be lecturing about. So September 3rd is pretty self-explanatory. Take a look at September 10th. Same thing, more reading summaries. September 17th, follow along with me. More reading summaries. September 24th, more reading summaries. The first part of the semester here is just going to be reading and reading summaries. So very heavy reading the first half of the semester, but then you'll see in October it's going to shift. So look at October 1st. To get ready for our October 1st class, there is no reading. And I'm not giving you any reading that week because that's the day your book review is due. So take that time, you don't have to do any reading, take that time and write your book review on the Tilt-A-Whirl because it's due October 1st. See how that works? Pretty simple. We get back to doing a little bit of reading on October 8th. Got a reading summary. October 15th. No reading for October 15th. Because that week you're going to be working on your midterm. So here's how the midterm is going to work. The midterm is actually going to be a take-home exam. So Caleb is going to write the exam and give it to you on October 8th in class. So October 8th, we'll give you the exam when you leave class, and you can take it home. It's open book, open note. Spend as much time on it as you want. 5 minutes, 5 hours, 50 hours. But you have a week to spend on it, and then you bring it back to class and turn it in on October 15th. That's when it's due. That's why you don't have any reading for that week, because you'll be working on your midterm. Does that make sense? Everybody have questions about the midterm? Pretty self-explanatory. October 22nd, we get back into the regular rigmarole. A little bit of reading, chapter summary due October 22nd. October 29th, no reading. And the reading is usually going to coincide with what I'm lecturing about. I did my best. It's not going to be perfect. But usually the reading that you'll do to prepare for class has to do with what I'm lecturing about. And I might not always agree with the author. One of the reasons we have these books is that I want you to, get different positions on things. So some of these authors, even Francis Schaeffer from time to time, I'm going to disagree with. But I want to expose you to different positions on these issues. But October 29th, there's no reading that's due because I want to give you time to work on your research paper. So nothing due on October 29th. That's why this will be so important for you to have this class schedule. You can just look and see what's going on this week. What do we got to do? No reading, but work on your research paper because it's due November 5th. Do you see that? So no reading for 2 weeks so you can concentrate on your research paper. This is the one you get to choose the topic. Right? November 12th, back a little bit normal. We got some reading summary due. November 19th, reading summary due when you come to class. November 26th, reading summaries.
That's Thanksgiving.
That's the day of Thanksgiving, isn't it? Wow.
You really are a slave driver.
Bring your turkey dinner and
Yeah. Bring leftovers.
Well, we will adjust that. Let Caleb and I think about how we'll adjust that. But what we might do is just move all of that to December 3rd.
to double up the content for the last 2 years, condense the content for the last.
No, if you look at December 3rd, there's no reading to prepare for.
Okay.
And what's due on December 3rd is your historical paper, right? That has to be the end of the semester, because so you've learned all this history, you can write your paper. And the final exam, we were going to have you take the final exam in class, so a little bit different than the midterm. Still be open note, but we were going to have you take it in class. So what we'll do instead is we'll send, just like the midterm, it'll be a take-home exam that we'll give you on December 3rd. So, and I'll change this and I'll have Caleb send out a new version of this with this corrected, but we'll move all the content from 26th of November to the 3rd of December. And what we'll do then on that last day is we'll give you the final exam to take home, and then we'll just give you a week to email it back in to Caleb by December 10th.
Sounds good.
So that'll be an easy change. I'm glad you caught that. Well, we couldn't have timed it any better because it is 8:59. So does anybody have a question we can answer in T-minus 20 seconds? Good. Well, I know a lot of details, a lot of information, class information and philosophy information, but I'm glad you guys are here in the class. It helps me, but I know there's a lot of people taking it online, so thank you for tuning in and being a part of the class, and I hope it's useful to everyone. All right. Thanks for coming tonight.